All right, we're going to go ahead and get started, and I think some people will continue to join us. Welcome, everyone. We're so excited to see you here. My name is Casey Dwyer, and I'm part of the Northwestern Community Services Board Prevention Department team, and I will be your moderator today. You are here for the first in our series of webinars, so thank you for being part of this inaugural day and service. We're putting these together in tandem with Mental Health Awareness Month and our Let's Talk About Mental Health campaign. Last week's theme was Owning Your Feelings, Chalk It Out. So today we'll be talking about coping skills and touching on some ways to chalk out our feelings. So just before we get into it, I want to go over a few housekeeping notes. As you may have noticed, all of you are muted and your videos turned off. We ask that you remain this way to maintain the webinar, the integrity of the webinar. So just make sure your videos and sound are off. And we also want to offer you the opportunity to ask questions at the end of this. We're going to have a Q&A time. So in order to submit your questions, you'll do that through the chat. And there's a way to chat to individuals instead of the whole group. So we ask that you send your questions to Amber Rainey, and you'll see the word host in parentheses next to her name. So go ahead and send those to Amber, and then I will be asking them at the end of the session. And you can do that at any point during the session. If Dr. Pandel says something that you want to follow up on, feel free to send that question to Amber. So I will go ahead and introduce our guest. Today we have Dr. Matt Pandel with us. Dr. Pandel is a trained behavioral psychologist and theologian. Dr. Pandel is first and foremost a problem solver. He has devoted his professional life to seeing people maximize their potential and realize their purpose. He holds certifications in life coaching, pastoral counseling, cognitive behavioral therapy, trauma-informed therapy, and neuro-linguistic programming. He's also a qualified mental health professional in the Commonwealth of Virginia. Good morning, Dr. Pandel. Thanks for being here with us.
Good morning. It's good to be with you.
So if it's okay with you, I think we'll just jump right into questions.
Sounds good.
All right. So first, we would love it if you could just start by talking about what coping skills are.
Sure. Coping skills is the anomaly in mental health. Most of the things we have in mental health that are kind of buzzwords, nobody knows what they actually mean. We throw them around, but the actual use of them is pretty complicated. Coping skills is the anomaly to that. They are very straightforward. These are just skills or strategies as a synonym for it. You often hear them called coping strategies, but they're really the same thing. Coping skills are just skills that we learn and implement to help us cope. They're designed to make us be able to deal with everyday life stressors, but then also deal with those extraordinary times. And of course, with COVID-19, we certainly are in an extraordinary time. We've never been this way before. And so a lot of the normal stresses we have in life tend to get magnified when we're in a place of crisis. And so there really are two general types of coping skills, and they're equally important, even though the latter is what we give most of our focus to. There's proactive coping skills, and then also reactive coping skills. Proactive skills are going to be those skills that you put in place long before you're actually dysregulated or stressed or depressed or any of the psychological concerns we have, thoughts of hurting yourself or others, any of those triggers that we're trying to avoid. Proactive strategies we put in place long before we become escalated or dysregulated. Conversely, then, reactive coping skills are those that we use when we are already escalated, where we are already worked up, we're already at that place of crisis, and we need something to kind of bring us back down to reality, to bring us back down to a more manageable handling of what we're facing. Some of the skills that we identify do fit in both categories. Some of them are uniquely for each person only beneficial in one of the two categories. An example of this is like with a young kid, deep breathing is a wonderful proactive coping skill. Of when just having the kid routinely, that's also called mindfulness, routinely check in on themselves and keep themselves on a nice even keel through deep breathing. However, if you have an 8-year-old with some attentional issues and some oppositional defiance, and they're in the midst of a full-on meltdown, probably not the best time to suggest they do some deep breathing. They might hit you. That is not the best time to implement that. So really knowing what category the coping skills are going to fall into for you is important. But, I mean, I've been doing this for about 20 years, and what I found is we focus a lot more on reactive coping skills. We're all about trying to find ways as both adults, but also the kids we care for, to keep them under control once they're upset. When in reality, if we did a lot more on the prevention side of things, as far as the proactive skills, we could diffuse a lot of this stuff before it even comes to a head.
Yeah, thank you for that. The clarification of the categories is really helpful. I'm just wondering, before we move on, if you could, I know you offered mindfulness as one example, but are there any other common coping skills that you could share with the group?
Sure. And what I will say, in my work, I work a lot with kids who are in very high levels of care. Kids who are in the foster care system, children who are in residential treatment, psychiatric hospitalization. And one real concern I've had is how much focus is on cookie cutter, where we almost say, here's a list of coping skills, just go through there and start circling. And those are going to be your assigned coping skills. Or even worse, we have adults assign coping skills to kids because, well, this kid does really well listening to music as a coping skill, so I'm going to go ahead and assign that to all the kids on my caseload. That really is not an effective method. You want to find what's going to work for each individual. In the or on the Youth Resource Alliance website, there's a section there of resources. One of those is this. That is not going to work because I have my screen on. I will tell you what it's called. Alphabet of Stress Management and Coping Skills. It is just an A through Z list of coping skills to get you started. And it's by no means exhaustive. It's just 2 pages. And if we sat down, we could probably come up with 300 coping skills without even really trying hard. Because again, a coping skill is just anything that helps you handle, cope, manage with whatever you're experiencing at a given time. And just as an example, as I'm looking through the list, one that's not on this list, but particularly in our community, that's frequently listed as a coping skill is some type of faith involvement. For example, attending churches, synagogues, mosques, prayer. Those are very frequently ones used, but it's not on the list. So the list is by no means exhaustive. It's just to kind of get us started. And just some samples on here are specific activities that you enjoy. One of my favorite proactive coping skills is there's a couple times a month that I, as part of my job, have to attend rapid fire mental health meetings. And they're all in an afternoon, and there might be 4 of them, or there might be 15 of them. And they are just one right after another, and they're mentally exhausting, they're physically exhausting. I know that at the end of that day, I am going to be absolutely tapped. I am not going to have any energy left, and I'm going to need a release. So rather than wait until I'm all worked up to plan and be reactive, I'm proactive. And so one of the things I like to do to blow off steam is I like to go to the shooting range. So I will actually reserve my lane at the range weeks ahead of these meetings coming up, knowing that I'm going to need it that day. And so I want to be proactive and be prepared for it. But yeah, I mean, for children, as simple as counting to 10, coloring, and we're seeing an resurgence with that both for adults and kids. There's a whole series now of adult-themed coloring books that can be very therapeutic, very cathartic. It just relaxes us and keeps us on an even keel. Aerobics and physical activity. As we said, you got to find the ones that are going to work for you. If you told me that I'm stressed, so I need to go for a jog, that would probably make me less happy and more stressed, but it might be something that would benefit you. Yeah. So knowing who you are and what makes you feel better. And there's really no science to figuring this out beyond, it's more of an art. It really is just when you are stressed in your life, when you've faced major stressors, what have been the things that calmed you down? What have been the things that got you recentered? Just as an example, my maternal grandmother, while an American, was an Anglophile. She loved all things British. She observed tea time at 11 and 3 each day. And so any visit to my mom's house involved observance of tea time. And she has since passed on, but she was such a sweet lady that anytime you were facing anything, anytime you were really uncertain about what direction to go, whether you're frustrated with your kids, or when you were younger, when you're frustrated with, career goals or relationships, mom was who you went and talked to, and mom broke out the tea set. That's just what mom did. And so to this day, when I am really facing either a major decision, or I'm really frustrated about something, or I'm not sure what direction to go, Earl Grey tea remains my go-to, because that is a vicarious way for me to be able to relive that experience of talking this out with my mom, and just that support and encouragement she provided. So on my list of coping skills that I try to have on the ready, particularly when I am reactive or I'm already escalated, a cup of Earl Grey tea is as effective for me as anything else. But again, you may hate tea. It might not work for you. It's finding those things that mean something to you. But that was something from my past that I knew calmed me. And I'm still able to use that to a good effect today. But the list is really endless.
Yeah.
For kids, one of my favorite ones is there was a product, and it's still available on Amazon. It's called Hawk gloves, like the Incredible Hawk.
Mm-hmm.
These are gigantic plush gloves. They are huge. And when you smash them together, it makes all kinds of sound effects, like, Hawk sad, all kinds of sound effects. And I deal, most of the kids I've worked with over the years have been kids with some oppositional dysregulation, some anger issues. So finding ways to meaningfully express that anger has been a real focal point of what we tried to do.
Mm-hmm.
And I found the most effective thing was these Hawk gloves. You stick these suckers on your hands, and we send them out and have them pound a tree. The gloves, I mean, you could put Evander Holyfield in these gloves and he couldn't damage the tree. So much less little Timmy age 12, okay?
Mm-hmm.
He goes out and just starts walloping this tree. Because the gloves are so padded, his hands are not at risk, the tree is not at risk, and he's releasing all of that frustration and rage. I've had clients that have used it as a proactive strategy where they spend a couple moments every day out pounding the tree. And I've had others who use it reactive, where this is when this kid is going to hit something. So let's try and get him in the gloves and hit the tree where nothing is hurt, both the child or the tree, because we got to protect the trees. But yeah, there's really no limit to it. Ripping of paper is another wonderful one. That works for adults too.
Mm-hmm.
I have a colleague I went to grad school with who has a very posh practice in New York City. And she actually has a room that you can rent, and you pretty much just go in there and destroy this room. Now the thing's in the room, not the room. You're not like pounding holes in the wall, but you're destroying objects in the room. And it is just this safe, confined release of all that frustration. That's pretty elaborate. We, New Yorkers, in Virginia, we don't do things like that. But that's out there. But ripping paper, screaming into a pillow, all coping skills really function from the idea that we as human beings have to have an outlet for what we feel. We can either internalize the emotion where we kind of swallow it down, think like the John Wayne silent type. You're not going to express it. You're just going to hold it in. That has consequences. There's some science that even suggests that has physical consequences as far as the risks of heart attack, stroke go up when there's repressed emotion. But then there's also the externalizing where you just start going off on everybody. And if we're thinking about this idea of proactive and why we utilize proactive, I am hoping with my virtual background, you'll be able to see my coffee mug. Can you kind of see it? Yeah, kind of see it. Okay. This is just my coffee mug. This is the world's cheapest illustration, but it's remarkably effective. If we think of this as us, okay, we are the coffee mug. And this, I'm going to take my virtual background off because this is going to drive me crazy. You are slowly coming to the realization that I do have self-diagnosed ADHD. No doctor has ever said I have it, but I'm convinced I do. So just let's go with it. But basically, here is my persona. This is Matt Pandel in liquid build form. And basically, we all carry levels of stress, right? We all carry relationships, finances, job front, your kids. We all carry stress. And what happens is if we're not good at proactively managing this stress and finding very careful ways to spill it out over time in a way that doesn't hurt anybody, doesn't hurt ourselves, eventually when a crisis comes and we have an influx of more stress, all that happens is it pours out and spills all over and we lose control of it. Those proactive skills are designed to keep this consistently low enough that when we do face struggles, when we do have particular challenges, we're able to manage those. Anytime, and I don't want anyone listening to take this harshly because it's true of me, it's true of all of us. Anytime we lose it, anytime we lose our temper, anytime we kind of go off on our kids, or again, if you're a strong silent type, John Wayne-ish type persona, every time you just shut down, that is indicative that you either don't have identified proactive coping skills, or at minimum, you're not using them. Because if we are using them, we are able to handle those types of stressors when they come.
Thank you. I was laughing earlier because my family used to have a set of those Hulk gloves, and my sister and I loved them.
They are wonderful. And it's a true story. This is off topic, but it cracks me up. Years ago, when I was doing a lot of private practice work, I bought them in bulk. I would buy like 10 pair of these at a time. And I remember the UPS guy dropping them off one day and really like, what is wrong with you? Who possibly needs 10 pair of these? Because they come like in big boxes that look like the Incredible Hulk. But yeah, so I'm sure my neighbors thought very odd things about them, but they're effective, and that's all that matters. They're very effective.
And for everyone watching, maybe we can get Amber to put the link to that list of coping skills that we have on the Youth Resource Alliance website into the chat so you can all see it, because it's a good one. So it's obvious from everything that you just said that coping skills are necessary and important for everyone, always. But I'm wondering if you can speak to the reason why they're particularly important for children to have.
Sure. And if I could segue something into that.
Sure.
With anything with kids, we can only give what we have.
Mm-hmm.
And this is true if you're a parent, if you're a grandparent, if you're a school teacher. If my buddy Deborah's on, I saw Deborah's a guidance counselor. Any role that you have where you are dealing with kids, you can only give them what you have. Mm-hmm. And so this is where it's so important that, again, when we're dealing with those strong silent types who don't want to express emotion, or conversely then those extreme extroverts who just believe they have to feel everything all the time and just express it as soon as they feel it. Mm-hmm. It's not about them. It's about their kids, because their kids are learning how to handle life stressors by watching them. Years ago, like in the 80s, there was this commercial where this kid's like making eggs, and his dad said, where did you learn about drugs? And he responds, I learned it from watching you. It's that same basic concept. We pick up what our parents did, good and bad. Mm-hmm. And so it's critical, before we even kind of talk about how kids are going to learn these skills, that the parents have coping skills, because you can't give what you don't have. Right now, especially with the COVID-19 thing, we have so many parents who are stressed, they're overwhelmed, rightly so. I mean, many of them are either unemployed, so you have the stress of that now because their income went away, or they're still working, and they're also full-time caregiving for their kids, mm-hmm. and educating them, or at least facilitating the education with the school through the different ways different school districts are teaching them right now. That's a lot of stress. And the number one thing I'm hearing from parents that just terrifies me is they don't have time for self-care. They're not doing anything for them because everyone needs them. And we're a day out from Mother's Day, which is almost a day where we embrace and glorify that selflessness. But let's just glorify it 1 out of the 365 days. You can't be a martyr every day, because again, eventually you have nothing left to give. Mm-hmm. So learn these skills yourself. By all means, go through this alphabet form as a list, just to get you started, and then supplement them with your own experiences and what proves effective. As far as for kids specifically, once you've taken care of you as an adult, and you now have something to give the kid, to help them be able to learn coping skills, kids are not fully developed in their brains. And that's just a reality. We used to think that, 18, because that was the age of maturity, the age of adulthood in the US, that magically meant you were competent. We now realize that the amygdala and the portion of the brain that controls impulse controls really doesn't stop developing until your mid to late 20s. And the consequence of this is you're going to see people make much more rash decisions the further they are from that fully developed brain. And so they have to have coping skills because their knee-jerk reaction is going to be to do whatever comes natural in that moment. And so if they're escalated, they're going to shout. If they are irritated or frustrated, they may act out aggressively. This is why if you look at like car accidents and such, we have a lot more accidents among those in their early 20s than we do those in their 40s and 50s. That the brain development of risk is very different the older you get. So you take a 9-year-old who has a very different concept of time, a very different concept of consequence to action. I mean, think about it, the worst thing a 9-year-old ever does, and they might be in the corner for 20 minutes. So it's their sense of consequence is so modified that they need to be coached. When you're doing coping skills, yes, it helps you because the kid stays calmer, the kid's able to maybe rebound faster when they do get escalated, but it's a much bigger picture than that. You are preparing them for adulthood. You're preparing them for life where, frankly, I get irritated with my bosses from time to time, as I imagine everybody on the screen does. But I like money, and I like being paid, and I like, keeping the electric on. That's kind of a personal goal I've set in life, is to have a roof over my head and, food and shelter and basic things. I can't just say anything that is on my mind, or no matter how angry or irritated I am, I have to have other ways of handling that stress and frustration, at times rage, but you have to find ways to deal with that. Kids don't innately know how to do that, but I would suggest adults don't either. Kids learn it in childhood, and then it moves forward into adulthood. So this isn't just about making your life easier, which is awesome because it will make your life easier. But it's about preparing your child to become an adult where they're not going to have you to bail them out. They're not going to have you there to calm them and get them regulated when they're getting worked up. Back to my mom example, mom's not here anymore. So at some point I had to implement the skills mom taught me, that tea works for me, tea calms me. I have to implement that. I don't have mom here to call me and say, you're getting worked up, why don't you have a cup of tea? I have to play that role myself. So we model that for young kids, with the goal being that as they become adults and become productive members of society, they're not going to be suffering from arrested development. They're not going to still behave as if they're kids, but they'll act like mature men and women.
Yeah. So you've talked about the importance of leading by example and teaching in that way, that teaching that happens naturally. I'm wondering, you spoke earlier that some of our ability to know what coping strategies work for us is sometimes based on self-awareness and what we can look back on. And, I can look back on my life and see things that helped me make it through tough times. A 6-year-old doesn't have that kind of hindsight. So are there any other ways that teaching can be done that are maybe a little bit more explicit than just modeling?
Sure. Although the 6-year-old doesn't have the ability to identify their coping strategies for the most part, the parent does. The teacher does. You've seen what these kids do when they're upset. When for prime example, when I have a client on my caseload right now who has been in foster care, has had a lot of different foster care placements, and as a consequence, his school has changed a lot. And so educationally, he's 2 or 3 grade levels behind, but they just keep promoting him socially because they don't want him to get left behind as far as his peer group. He is then a third grader who functionally cannot read at all. He can identify the letters of the alphabet, and that's it. So anytime there's any kind of reading activity in class, he loses it. When he loses it, he starts punching, hitting, he throws desks. And so we sat down as a team and was like, okay, all behavior has something it's trying to get. There's something you're trying to acquire by behaving this way, even if you don't realize it. So what he's trying to get is, one, to not be made fun of, but his expression was physical. He's not internalizing, so he's not sitting there quietly. So like having him listen to music is probably not the most effective coping skill because he's not internalizing. He already is expressing things manually. He's hitting and kicking and hurting people. So for him, that's sending us a clear sign he needs a form of physical release. So when we're trying to find coping skills for that kid, even though he can't tell us, I need to punch something, we as adults watching him see, okay, when he's worked up, he needs to get physical. So now we need to find ways for him to get physical in a safe way. I have had schools create intervention plans for kids where when they're really getting escalated, they go to a corner of the gymnasium that has those old school 1970s wrestling mats. And the kid just goes to the corner and starts wailing on this wrestling mat. They're held up with Velcro on the wall. So he grabs the mat and throws it to the ground and starts pounding it on the ground. And eventually exhausts himself and goes right back to class. And the day continues as if nothing ever happened. Conversely, had he chosen to do that exact same behavior, but against a person or against an object that could have caused harm to him, we then have to hold safety planning meetings, and the parents have to come into the school, and we have to make sure the other kids that were involved were safe. And there's all these post-event processings that we have to do. It's finding by observing what is going to be effective for that individual kid. And for the kids I work with who don't have parents, we don't have the advantage of them having had someone who was watching them for years and years and can give us that feedback. So it requires us to really operate as a team. Well, when I'm with him and he gets upset, this is what he does. What does he do when he's with you? Okay, all right. So both of those, what's the commonality? In both instances, he gets aggressive. So we got to find a way for him to be aggressive without hurting himself or hurting somebody else. And if there's any teachers on the line, I just want to preface this real quick. I was a teacher, and some of this namby-pamby psychology stuff would irritate me from time to time because I have a room of 35 children. Although I was hired to have a room of 21, I nevertheless have a room of 35 children. And you're telling me that I'm just going to have kids randomly leaving my room to go punch a styrofoam wall in the gym, and I'm supposed to be okay with that. I have never seen a child who does that long term. Skills change over time as our internal baseline adjusts as we mature. That kiddo who I'm mentioning who does the punching, where we had their intervention plan of punching the gym mat, that was 2 or 3 years ago. He still doesn't do that. Okay, he's found other ways to express that as he's gotten older and more mature, and ways that are a lot less invasive to the school teacher or the classroom setting. All interventions are always short-term because we're always changing. It's like taste buds. What you didn't like when you were 6, you may love when you're 15. It's embracing that change, but it being very slow and methodical. So as you identify what you think might be beneficial as a strategy for that child, start implementing it. Start implementing it as a proactive step, even if you plan on it eventually being used as reactive. Here's why. Anything you do to a child when they're escalated, they interpret as punishment. Anything. If I am behaving a certain way, anything that parent does to me or teacher or counselor in that moment is because I'm being bad. Because kids are aware they're being bad. They know what they're doing isn't right. Just as we as adults usually know when we're not being our best. So if you teach it to them on the proactive side, when you try to implement it when they are escalated in that reactive side, it's not punishment because it's something mom or dad has you do all the time. Every time when you come into class, it used to be very popular with kids who had a lot of impulse control and excess energy. Teachers would, okay, we have 3 minutes. I want you to run around the room, get some of that energy out, and then we sit down and start our day. If a teacher does that with a kid every single time they see them, when the kid becomes escalated and the teacher asks them to run, well, that's just what Miss Smith does. She just makes me run. So it's teaching it on the proactive side tends to make it more effective once we hit that reactive period. But yeah, encouraging them to use the skills. And it shouldn't, I mentioned earlier, a lot of the kids I work with are in residential settings, and a lot of times it seems as if their coping skills are cookie cutter, where someone just has a standard list, and so they give it to you and say, here's your coping skills. I've had clients who could not pick their coping skills out of a lineup because it was a very top-down process. Talk it out with them, and don't do it when they're escalated. But when you're having a really good moment, it's Saturday afternoon and maybe you just watched a movie together as a family and the kid's really calm and enjoying the day and you're having a good day too. Talk to them about, hey, when mom gets upset, I really need to drink a cup of tea. Or I like to go for a walk, or I like to call your aunt, and that just makes me feel much better. What makes you feel better? And just see what they respond with. Kids by and large know fully well what calms them. They just don't know how to implement it. So they can be a really valuable resource in figuring out what will help them calm down. And then the parent almost puts that into a translation of, okay, so now how can I help support that, while making sure that we are monitoring for safety for everybody involved. Because another thing I probably should have mentioned at the beginning, coping skills is a neutral term. All of us cope all the time. There's not a single person alive that doesn't have coping skills. They might just not be good coping skills. Alcoholism began as a coping skill. It may be a disease on the back end, but it started as a coping skill. You were drinking to avoid something else, or to experience a feeling you didn't know how to access any other way. So it really is just exchanging ineffective, dangerous, harmful coping skills for productive ones that can produce positive change in our lives.
That's an important distinction. Thank you for that. I just want to pause before my next question and encourage everyone, if you've had any questions throughout this or wanted follow up on anything that Dr. Pandel has been talking about, remember that you can submit questions through the chat to Amber. So you can just click her name and submit one to her privately, and we'll get to those in a bit. So Dr. Pandel, as I'm hearing you talk, it sounds like coping skills change throughout our lives. And yeah, I liked your taste bud analogy. How can we, when a child in our life a coping skill is no longer working, maybe it was great before, but now it's really not helpful, how can we help the child adjust? How can we adapt to find more positive ones moving forward?
Well, and I think that's a great question, because what happens is, I have cared for other people's children. I've been a foster parent and such. But I don't have children of my own. So most of my experience with this is working with kids who we have no baseline on. We have no life experience telling us what will work. So more often than not, though, when we're caring for kids, we kind of operate on a checklist mentality of, okay, I taught coping skills, done. And so now we move on to hygiene or whatever else our other kiddie skill is that this child needs to know to be successful. It should be an ever evolving process. You should be prepping for new coping skills long before the old ones stop working. It's proactive. So we're always reevaluating what's working and what's not working, because it is going to change over time. And with most individuals, and there are exceptions, but most individuals, what was an effective coping skill at age 6 is not going to be effective at age 60. And so accepting it's going to change, and that continual process of always asking. If you're a parent of let's say you're a school teacher, because I've used parents a lot. Let's say you're a school teacher, and so these are not your kids per se. They feel like your kids, but they're not your kids. You don't have to pay to send them to college. That is the definition of what is your child. So as a teacher, you don't have to pay to send them to college. You care about them, but they're not really yours. They are with you for a set period of time. You used to notice that every time this kid would get upset, anytime they missed a question in class, anytime someone, made an unkind comment about them, they would get really quiet and go sit in the corner and maybe rock. And so you had interventions set up for them where they'd always go to that corner. So maybe you put in that corner a favorite toy of theirs, something that they could go and use that would then get them back to their seat and functioning again post-incident. If you now find that same kid, same scenario, he's being picked on or, whatever caused it to begin with, you're noticing that happen again, and now he's leaving the room. Okay, so he's not going to the corner anymore, so I can kind of scrap that idea of the corner and the toy. Where is he going? Is he going to another teacher's classroom? And this is one of those tough love moments. So everybody just calm yourselves and hear me out. Not every child in your care is always going to turn to you for support. There's times where even though you're mom and they love you, they may be a lot more comfortable talking to Aunt Karen about this than talking to you. Even though you're their classroom teacher and you blood, sweat, and tears for these kids, It may be the art teacher down the hall that they only see for 20 minutes once a week, who is the person that they want to go to help calm and process. Don't take it personal. Accept it, embrace it, encourage it, and coordinate with that person. I have a client right now, a 13-year-old girl that functions more like she's 7, a lot of trauma. She is in a specialized classroom. Her teacher is wonderful with her. But when she gets escalated, when she feels like she's being picked on or whatever else, she was running out of the room all the time. And so what we found was she always went to the assistant principal every single time. So we set up a policy of, you know what, every Tuesday at 10 a.m., you get to have 20 minutes with Miss Rebecca was the teacher, with the assistant principal, and you guys can do whatever you want. And we actually found that what the kids started doing is when they were getting frustrated or irritated, they weren't leaving the room anymore. They had a little notebook where they were writing down what they wanted to do when they were with Miss Rebecca next. Mm-hmm. So it's allowing other people to be important in kids' lives and not try to monopolize. Again, that's that martyr syndrome again, that it's not just about me meeting that kid's need, but maybe there's somebody else who can help meet that too, and following the kid's direction. So I tend to ramble, but I think the original point of the question was the bunny trails. Again, the adult ADHD kicks in. The bunny trails just pick me up. But basically, as soon as something stops working, immediately we shift focus to, okay, well, what are they doing now? Mm-hmm. What are they doing? Because everyone has coping skills, even if they're bad. So how is the kid coping right now? And how can we translate that into a positive? And even crazy things, you know, when we're dealing with teenagers, for example, where the coping skill could be very serious drug use. There are positives we can turn that to. I've had a lot of teenage clients where substances is what they turn to, marijuana in particular, but often escalating into other substances. For them, exercise has been very effective as a coping skill. Nutritional education has been great too, particularly with the what I'm going to call the marijuana crowd, and I don't mean that to be disrespectful, but I don't know how else to refer to them. But those who are convinced this is an herbal thing, it's good for you, and you know, it's not a gateway drug, you all are crazy if you think that those individuals. For them, okay, well then let's talk about what else is good to put in your body that won't get you arrested. There's a lot of education available out there now on supplements that individuals can take that are beneficial for us. Different foods that have psychopharmacological benefits in the body. So that can be a coping skill of, okay, well, you can't use drugs because you're going to go to jail, but what are things you can put in your body that will produce the desired effect you want, of elated sense of well-being, et cetera, but that, again, won't get you put in jail. But yeah, it's really just continually identifying what they're doing now and how do I translate that into something positive. But yeah, it's never just a checklist of, yeah, we did coping skills, they have them, we're good. It's constantly reviewing them because they are going to change over time, very frequently in some cases.
Well, we're starting to get some questions from the group coming in, and this one that I'm looking at right now ties perfectly to what you were just saying about, you know, kids go to different people, different adults in their lives for help getting through things. And so this question says, how best should a parent work with school to help them get on board with implementing strategies that may be outside the box?
What I would suggest, and this is spoken as somebody who works a lot with schools, schools mean very well, that they want to help your child, but at times you almost have to approach it with them as a team from the beginning. I've noticed some pushback, for example, if maybe I've been working in sessions with a kid on coming up with some coping skills, and then we simply give that list to the school, and the school looks at us like we have 3 heads, like, no, excuse me, we're responsible for the child's education. We'll come up with coping skills that work here. Whereas if when I'm starting that process, I get my releases of information, because God bless HIPAA, we got to keep everybody happy. But once I have my releases and I talk to the school ahead of time and say, hey, we're really trying to find some ways that work. Can you let us know what's working for you? And then we collectively come up with one unified plan that everybody can get on board with. Most schools I've found are really going to be great to work with that. There are exceptions. We all know exceptions. We all could list exceptions, but we're not going to here. It wouldn't be prudent. But we all know those exceptions exist. When those exceptions exist, that's where the role of a parent really kicks in. That's where you have to aggressively advocate. Now, you can aggressively advocate without being a quote unquote Karen and just going around and wanting to talk to the manager or the principal all the time. There's other ways to advocate. Volunteering at the school is an awesome means of advocacy because teachers are overwhelmed, the school is overwhelmed. If you become a presence at the school, they're going to be much more prone to hear you out as to the interventions you're trying to implement. The school guidance department is a wonderful resource to go to. If you find you're really not getting anywhere with your child's teacher, and you've kind of analyzed why, like, have I come across wrong? Have I contributed to this dysfunctional relationship? Once you cross that bridge and you think there's nothing else you could do, talk to the guidance department. They are a much better next stop than the principal's office. Principals hire and fire. Nobody wants to be pulled rank on. Go to the guidance department, and often they have a good rapport with the teachers and can get them on board with trying some strategies that otherwise they wouldn't.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. We have another one here. Sorry, reading two at once. What age do you feel is the best time where a child can start to grasp coping skills, or a good time for a parent to start implementing them?
Birth. When we were starting off here, when we were coming into the room and getting situated, Amber's son Levi kept popping on the screen periodically. And that's the best part of this whole COVID thing, is I'm in a lot of Zoom meetings and I get to meet all these great kids that I otherwise wouldn't get to meet. But when he comes on the screen, and he can't stay on the screen, right? Amber has to move him away. The way she moves him away from the screen is the implementation of a coping skill. Every time she moves him away from the screen, he doesn't hit her. He doesn't start screaming and crying. No, because she sends him to do another activity, or she distracts him with something else that he can do. That's coping skill. We want to get past this thinking of it being some formal psychological concept, and it's just part of who we are. We all cope all the time. There was the Ferber Method was a big thing with babies when I was in undergrad school, that you just didn't touch them. Just let the child cry and they'll self-soothe. That was effective for some children. For others, they just, were crying into their 7 and 8 year old lives because no one ever held them. So figure out, as you're dealing with your little kids, what are they trying to get? Do they want your attention? That's often it. Do they want time alone? There is evidence that even little babies can be somewhat introverted at times, where they want to be left alone. They don't want every aunt, uncle, cousin, grandparent holding them all the time. Sometimes they just want to sit quietly in the bassinet or the swing and be left alone. So coping skills, really, from the minute they are out of the womb, there's an element of coping skills at work. Of course, you're not having formal instruction to them as, let's discuss your coping skills. But as they get older and are more able to understand what the coping skills are, that really is going to be age appropriate, no different than discussing parts of the body with a child and what those body parts are for and do. There's more information as you get older. It really is the same thing, but the initiation of the coping strategy concept is really at birth.
Okay. I'm going to ask one more question. This one feels really important because, as you've talked about today, coping skills are important all the time, especially in really challenging times, which we kind of agree we're in right now. But this question is, what are signs that may indicate an individual needs to seek out additional support for coping during difficult times?
That is a great question. I tend to side with more of a preventative attitude toward this. I generally recommend that we treat mental health no different than we treat physical health. And it was mentioned in my bio, the the faith theological community is part of my background as well. And it's always been concerning to me how willing we are to send someone to the primary care doctor because their blood pressure is high. But yet there's resistance in some faith communities to send them to a psychiatrist because they clearly are bipolar. We have to treat mental health and physical health equally, and have the same attitude toward both. So just as if your kid is not behaving the way they normally do, they're not sleeping well, they're not eating the way they normally would, or they're eating a lot more than they normally would, just as you'd send them to the primary care doctor for a workup in that instance, similarly, seeking mental health intervention at that time is appropriate too. Mental health intervention is not just because we know there's a problem, you know what it is, and you want help for that problem. It also can be accessed when something just isn't right and I don't know what it is. Depending on the quality of your primary care doctor or your pediatrician, they can play that role. I have worked with many pediatricians in our region who are very educated when it comes to children's mental health. I have one who's a friend in the Harrisonburg area who actually was a master's level therapist for years before finishing her MD. And so she's wonderful as a first step. You just make a primary care 15, 20-minute appointment, and she can screen for what may or may not be a serious concern. And then, of course, she refers them to somebody else for actual treatment. But additionally, there's a lot of great screening tools that you can implement to kids online. I can give you a couple of them here just that people can Google. These are free ones. The MFQ, the Mood and Feelings Questionnaire. This is a very simple scale. I think it's a 4-point Likert scale, which just means like everything from this statement is not true at all, a little true, sometimes true, and definitely true. You can go through it with kids. I believe for parents, it's from age 6 to 17 is the parent version, where you're completing it on the child, your observation. And then there is a child version of it they complete themselves, which I believe is ages 8 to 17. But that's free. Just Google it, Mood Feelings Questionnaire, it comes up. And it will give you a score at the end that suggests the severity of, in the case of the MFQ, depression. But there are stress indexes. Let's see, there's the Spence Children's Anxiety Scale, the SCAS, Spence Children's Anxiety Scale. That's another free one you can access online by Googling it. It's, I believe, for children 8 to 14. Self-report for them, but then there's also an adult one you can take as well. And and this is great too, because it compares what you're seeing as a caregiver or a teacher with what the child is perceiving. Because what you're often going to find is, particularly with boys, what I observe as an adult is this kid is oppositional and needs his butt kicked because you can't treat people that way. Whereas his scores actually show this kid is depressed and this is how he manifests that depression. So those scales are very valuable. The center, this is a long one. It's just the acronym CES-DC, CES-DC. It's the Center for Epistemological Studies Depression Scale for Children. But again, CES-DC. If you Google that, it's the only thing that's going to come up. That's another free one. It's an excellent depression scale. By all means, use these with your kids. There's even some great apps that you can download for your phones on Android or Apple that have these built into them. When you're not sure, start with a good screening tool like that. Talk to your primary care doctor and get their input and see what direction they think you should go. One thing I always want to encourage families too, there's very few mental illnesses that are lifelong. There are some that are enduring. The vast majority are not. Meaning they are situational. When we get through whatever is in that moment, if we get good treatment and good intervention and good support, it typically goes away. And so don't think that taking your child to see a counselor, for example, is going to mean, oh my gosh, what have I done? He's going to be in therapy the rest of his life. The statistical likelihood of that is very low. Just as taking your kid to the doctor because they have strep throat does not mean they're always going to have strep throat and are always going to be going to the doctor all the time. It's a snapshot, a moment in time. And if they need the intervention right now, get them the intervention. But again, the primary care is a great place to start. The school is another great resource. Now, not as effective during COVID-19 as it would be in most other crisis situations, but seeing what changes they're noting is beneficial as well, because it's also helpful knowing what's environmental. What is happening. I mean, this is just an example. I had a situation with a client at one point where his parents got divorced. He had a cousin who he was very close with die in a car accident. He failed a class he had to pass to graduate, and he is a senior, so he is now going to have to go to summer school. He can't walk across the stage with his peers. And a grandparent had a stroke and was no longer communicative. Like, was, I don't want to use the term vegetable, but was not communicative. They could no longer speak. Figuring out what exactly was causing his depression and this, he had significant rage come out of this, was very hard to do, because that's a lot of stressors all at one time, and pinpointing which one is very challenging. But the school was invaluable in that instance, because what they found was there were some classes where the teachers didn't even notice anything was wrong, because he was still maintaining in those classrooms, which then led us to, okay, well, what is it about those classrooms that made him able to manage? And what it really just came down to was they weren't treating him any differently, because they didn't know that he had had these deaths and losses and other challenges. And he just wanted somewhere he felt normal, because at home, everyone's crying, everyone's upset, everyone's sad. And at school, those teachers didn't know, so he could feel normal in their presence. But yeah, so it really is just being as mindful as you can be about what the kid is feeling. And if it reaches a point where you talking to them doesn't seem, I'm talking just like, well, what's going on, buddy? You don't seem like yourself. If that is insufficient, next step is those free screening tools that are accessible online free of charge. And by all means, if some of those come back in the elevated, or concerning numbers, take those with you to the primary care appointment with your family doctor, and take it from there. And of course, I'm speaking here as we see a gradual increase and we're becoming slightly concerned. I think the question was phrased as, if you're kind of concerned, what do you do? That's very different from if you are definitely concerned, as in he's threatening to hurt himself or hurt somebody else. He's making statements like, I don't want to live anymore, things like that. If you're hitting that, by all means, reach out to the appropriate mental health supports, which would typically either be, if it's an emergency at the moment, taking the child to the local ER to be screened there, or by calling the crisis services department at Northwestern, which is accessible just by calling any of the general Northwestern intake numbers. And one of the options, I believe, is if you need to speak with our crisis services department, press blah, blah, blah. I think it's 4, but don't quote me on that.
Great. Well, this has been wonderful. Dr. Pandel, thank you for being here, for sharing your expertise and experience. This has been a really great conversation, and really timely, I think. These are all things that are particularly important right now. And I want to thank everyone else for being here. Like I said, this is our first one, so it's really exciting that so many of you joined us. Like I mentioned before, we have our Let's Talk About Mental Health campaign going on right now. And this week's topic is finding the positive. We're talking about the good. So be sure to check out our social media at Lord Fairfax YRA. We can put that in the chat, but you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, and see what we're up to and how we are honoring and celebrating Mental Health Awareness Month. And we will be planning more webinars, so and we will be sending you emails about future webinars. So thank you to everyone. Thank you especially to Dr. Pandel. We're so happy you were here, and hopefully we'll see you all soon.